In this episode, we talk with Minyang Jiang, Chief Strategy Officer at Credibly, where she leads growth, innovation, and the company's work with generative AI. We explore how Credibly uses AI in lending, why generative AI requires a different approach than traditional automation, and where human judgment still matters. Minyang also shares lessons on building trust, encouraging adoption, and finding the right balance between people and AI at work. Welcome, everyone. Excited about this podcast today. We have on with us Minyang Jiang, Chief Strategy Officer at Credibly. Welcome to the show, MJ.
I'm so happy to be here, Hunter.
Happy to have you. So, to kick things off, you have quite an interesting story and background, and so I'd like to start there with kind of your origin story.
Wow, my origin story. Sure. It is a bit jumbled, but I'll try to be brief. So I was born in China. I was born in Shanghai, and I'm an immigrant. I immigrated to New York when I was around 8.5, 9 years old, went to a lot of different schools, went to this college on the East Coast. My first job out of college, I was actually in human rights in DC. So very much worked in the nonprofit sector. And then I went back to business school, got my MBA in marketing operations and operations management, marketing and operations management at Wharton. And then I moved to the Midwest. I'm in Michigan now, and I worked for Ford Motor Company. Within Ford, I was part of their marketing leadership program, so did a lot of product launches, selling cars to dealers, customer research. And then I tried to launch my own mobility business within Ford, which went really well until the company pivoted to autonomous vehicles. I spun it out, did my own thing, did not do so well there, definitely failed, definitely learned from it. COVID hit, and then I sort of stayed home, and I was having my second child at that time. And then the prior chief CFO, the CFO of Fort Credit had joined Credibly, which is where I'm at right now. So it's a fintech platform. And he said, hey, you have all this marketing experience and we need to professionalize the marketing organization. Why don't you come in and help us? So that's how I ended up at Credibly. And since then, I've been responsible for the growth side of the company with an with an eye towards innovation. So I run all of the marketing and sales teams here. I run all of employee development, which will tie it into a lot of the AI conversations we're having. And I also run what's called the Skunkworks team within Credibly, which is an innovation incubator team, which has been the group behind a lot of the automation and generative AI efforts. So I love what I do. It cuts across multiple complex initiatives from change management to tech innovation. And that's why I'm here talking to you today.
Great. I feel like you glossed over massive journey there, but I do have one question about that origin story, and then we can get into your work at Credibly, which is, you come out of Cambridge and you're working in the nonprofit sector for a while, and then you decide MBA and go into kind of the corporate world. What triggered that? What made you kind of shift your focus there?
Many things. So I was a literature major in Harvard undergrad, and something I would never change. I've always loved reading. I've always loved books. And so when I went into nonprofit, I had done modern Chinese literature at Harvard. And so my human rights work was related to a think tank in DC that's then specifically looking at marginalized groups in China. And I learned a lot. It was a lot of critical thinking, professional organization. For the first time, I had to learn how to put my writing and reading and communication skills. It was an entry-level associate job, but it was definitely more of an intellectual type of work. At the same time, though, I think because we were making grants at the time, I really understood that I needed to kind of figure out how money moves through the economy, right? And so really wanted to look at the intersection between public and private sectors, which is what got me interested in the MBA. On a side note, because of the work I was doing was relatively sensitive, Chinese government also kind of had a file on me. The consulate had a file on me at the time. So there was a risk that I was just not allowed to go back to China, which was something that my family was a little bit nervous about. I was less nervous about it, but understandably, my parents were nervous about it. And so when I left, I had originally wanted to pursue sort of a junction between private and public enterprises, but I had so much fun at Wharton as an undergrad, as an MBA, that I decided to just continue really pursue business. And I really found my calling, right? Like I love being in business and I can't really imagine doing anything else at this point.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. So let's talk about Credibly for a little bit. You're running a lot there, it sounds like. Tell me about, so when you got there, it was pre-generative AI, is that right?
For sure. Yeah.
For sure.
The
Okay.
world was pre-generative AI.
Right, right. Not just Credibly, but it was prior to November of 2022 or whenever that was.
Right. Hmm.
And so you've been in witness and leading basically the kind of AI journey at Credibly. The name of this podcast is The Killer Use Case. I'm
Hmm.
curious, do you remember the first kind of big use case that moved the needle at Credibly with kind of generative AI or any form of AI? Like, where did it get started?
Yeah. Yeah. So it was interesting because it was March when GPT 3.5 first got onto the scene. And it was, everybody's reading the articles in New York Times or whatever other major publication they're looking at. And I remember going to the CEO and saying, like, hey, we should really think about taking a leadership position on this because there's going to be a lot of fear. There's going to be a lot of let's wait to adopt. And this is a learning technology. This is a technology that kind of scales with learning. And so we need to learn and make mistakes and know how to run small pilots and the learning curve. And I think people think the learning curve with AI is like, oh, just AI does everything. But really, embedding AI as part of enterprise and control and change management is its own learning curve. So I said, we have to start now. So interestingly enough, the very first use case, as you talked about, was solving for industry classification in our space. So a little bit about lending, right? Obviously, depending on what industry you are giving money to, the risks can be higher or lower. So there are prohibited industries in our space. There's things like trucking and logistics, staffing, where the cost of goods sold is really high. You expect to see, and depending on spot prices and what's going on in the macro economy, these industries can be either much less risky or more risky. And so one of the key criteria and pretty much in any lending, not just in fintech, but traditional bank lending or whatever, is to businesses is what is the industry that your business is in. So everyone in our space, I would argue to date, uses what's called the Nexus Code database from the government, which is a series of like 10,000 codes. You can get as granular or as general as you want to identify the industry. And then that is then pinned to a business and that is then used to assess risk. This is very common across the board. The issue, though, is that that database was obviously not meant for adjusted lending. It's just meant as a classification system. So think about like how you would classify like plants or animals, right? All the way down to the genus and species level. It could be very specific, and you may not need that level of granularity. And also, what are you doing with it? If you're doing more than identification, there needs to be some risk adjusted understanding of how does it actually talk about the business? What does this business look like within the industry? Is that normal? Is the cash flow normal? Does it look very attractive? Is it not as healthy? So what we actually did is we used generative AI to create our own risk adjusted segments. And we were able to automatically determine what the industry was, but in a much more precise way from a risk perspective. And I remember working with the Skunkworks team. This is our first use case. We actually ended up getting a patent for the categorization of it, where this was back with like GPT 3.5. So nowhere near the powerful models of today, where like the business people were like coming up with like keywords to help try to find, what this look like from a retrieval augmented generation perspective and how do we build vector databases around these keywords. And this was really like on the ground learning at that time, right? Like I remember going through JSONs and just like myself and just being like, what is this field and how do I build keywords around this to help determine how do I scrape websites and use online presence to figure out which keyword that match to our vector database was all very crude. It's something that models, frankly, today, you can just kind of ask and it'll give you probably a pretty good answer. But at the time, the real emphasis at Credibly was on learning. And when we actually launched it and we got two patents for it, even though this doesn't seem like a big deal today, back then, which was, 3 years ago at this point, there was no one doing this, right? There's no automated classification of industry at that point. And which makes it so that like you were manually searching for it each time. I know companies who had offshore teams, that's all they did was to figure out what the industry was and type in a code. And this made the customer experience worse because you were waiting for people to find what an industry is. So we were able to automatically classify it, have it run 24/7, and then also engender other use cases from it. So another product we developed from this experience is figuring out the web presence as associated with a business, right? So understanding like a restaurant should probably have a web presence, a web page, some reviews, whereas like a one-man construction or, a contractor, maybe not. And so understanding what kind of web presence made sense for what business, and then using generative AI to come up with an understanding of that, which was again like a use case that was not possible prior to the existence of Gen AI. So those are two use cases that were very much now years old, seems like eons ago, but we had spent probably the longest amount of time developing them, and now things have accelerated since then.
Got it. So, I'm noticing a trend with those two, which is that you are generating, kind of unique data that other lenders don't look at, or maybe they do today, but they weren't looking at them then, to better inform your risk profiles and help make lending decisions. Is that like a path that you guys have continued on and identified even more of this kind of extra data about businesses that you're able to collect and synthesize with Gen AI?
Part of it is, I think, understanding how to repackage the data. So rather than going from just simple identification, but linking up that identification with what you're actually doing with it, right? Which is assessing risk. And so being able to couple that relationship tighter with generative AI. We also did a lot of data, just learning how to do pure data extraction, parsing tax returns and things like that, which is harder than it sounds. In fact, I think if people use ChatGPT today, right, it's like sometimes you're just like, here's a document, go find this information. And it's like, I can't find it. You're like, it's literally on page 7. Or it's like, here it is. And you're like, that's a hallucination. So this stuff is at an enterprise level, it's harder because you have to be very consistent. The ability to extract the right information is a core skill set in working with generative AI. I think building relationships and coupling relationships closer so that you're not doing this assembly line type of work where you can do multiple steps at the same time, right? With a real storytelling. That's what a lot of agents are kind of trying to move towards to these days. But building those relationships in a multi-step process, that's something that we have started to continue to extrapolate. I think our use of Gen AI has gotten more sophisticated. So one of the things that we're working now is around agentic pricing, which is asking very sophisticated questions around how cash flows should behave given the business, given where it's located, given seasonal effects. And these are all things that require sort of half-step human reasoning and processing, which are good use cases for generative AI, right? One
Mm.
of the biggest things that I see people kind of make mistakes on, and we made this mistake in the very beginning as well, is they equate Gen AI with pure automation. And so I had some of my sales guys tell me the other day, I'm like, how can you make your own work more efficient? They're like, oh my gosh, I have to write these templated emails. I wish I could just like, I'm saying the same thing each time and I wish I could do that faster. I'm like, well, that's not a Gen AI project. That is an automation project, right?
Mhm.
That is a rules based. You're trying to do the same thing each time. You're trying to be very consistent and you're not really using the generative aspect of AI. You're not trying to be creative. You just want the same thing. So you can be rules bound. And I think a lot of business people, as they get into working with Gen AI, that's one of the first things that's confusing for people, which is usually it's the data science teams and tech teams that have enabled automation. And the business people who are not technical are not really involved in the automation of tasks. And so the first things people try to do is like they try to automate exactly what they're doing. And Gen AI is not good for that. It's not good for doing complete automation of the things that you want to do. And the first year, incredibly, when we were doing the industry model and all these models, we tried to reproduce exactly what the underwriters at that time were doing. And that was a complete failure. It never got better than humans, right? Because it was trying to reproduce something that it wasn't good at. It's a generative model. And so you have to let it be a little bit more flexible. So then we start asking questions like, well, why are we doing this? Do we have to do it this way? And now the team has learned that question is the first you're asking. And that's how you really use Gen AI in a way that's meant to be used to be faster and more successful. So these are the kind of things that I think we have learned. And we definitely learned through like probably 9 months of deploying something because we were so bent on like, we need to mimic what people are doing and their process. And their process, it's not great for Gen AI, right? We have these checklists that we are like, oh, we have to ask these kind of questions. And by the way, we have these rules that we apply to like, what is declining cash flow? Okay. Humans can only remember so many rules. So I can give them one formula, but that formula could be different for every business. But humans cannot remember and come up with like 50,000 different math formulas. That's way too complicated. But Gen AI is very good at that. It can come up with its own formula to assess every business given the context of the business that it's in. So these are things that you really have to kind of pull different levers on in terms of considering like what's a great use case for generative AI.
Yeah, we found here at Barefoot that most of our automations are, let's call it 85% code. And there's like one node or two nodes in the workflow that actually hits a large language model because we need a little bit of reasoning, right? There's a little bit of judgment in there. But the rest of it is it's just RPA, right? It's just robotic process automation, which has been
Right.
around for 30 years. But that is a misconception that we're constantly battling against, you and I both. One question that kind of came up there as you were talking about all the different use cases, right? You're using this data, particularly around risk you talked about, to inform, lending decisions, which have major downstream implications for the businesses that are applying for these, right? Whether or not they can hire somebody new or whether or not they're even going to be able to keep the lights on and things like that. How do you combat the risk of bias from these models leaking into your lending decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that that is something that every organization is going to have to address. So there's different types of bias, right? And it depends on what kind your organization is most subject to, and then what is the human side of it. And then how do you stand up the right guardrails? So first, there is bias in the data itself, in the training data itself. You cannot get away from that. There's plenty of evidence of, I think even up to the last generation of models of asking the GPT-5s to generate left-handed, people is really hard because there's the very small sample in the training data. Google Gemini has run into some problems when it started to create historically inaccurate descriptions, trying to compensate for, say, the representation of people of color in history. So the bias encoded in training data is going to be present because the data is trained on the internet and on the history, and those who have had more privilege in history are the ones that are producing the data. So that's something that I think every company needs to understand. Now, how does that affect, say, specifically what we're doing? We have to be very careful in thinking through certain things. So, for example, if you're a company that's let's say on the recruiting side, right? On the recruiting side, there's a lot of opportunities for you to make sure that you're not just taking what the Gen AI recommendations are because you're trying to find the most effective candidate and letting it run wild with like understanding what that means. In terms of risk assessment, it depends on what data you're feeding into it. Now, it's very good at pattern detection. So it can even figure out Gen AI models can figure out, for example, whether a piece of writing was done by a man or a woman with nothing other than just feeding the writing into it. So there's data that's sort of inherently giving you the bias in the code, right? And so essentially what we're doing is what part of use case in the workflow you are using it to do specific kinds of tasks and then letting the humans do the other types of tasks. And what I'm specifically referring to is the intelligence model, right? Your company should have an intelligence model and understand what are humans good at and what is Gen AI good at. So Gen AI is really good at two things in the intelligence model, which is data extraction and data analysis, which is like taking large amounts of information, more than what a human can possibly comprehend, right? And then being able to give you structured analysis and tell you what these things could potentially mean when given in the context of your organization. However, it is not good at, nor should you use it without, I would say, safety rails for prioritization and decisioning. So humans are better at understanding what is more important to the organization and how do you actually make the best optimized decisions. So when you are using generative AI, the use case itself is figuring out what steps do you want the model to actually handle for you? And what steps are you doing a model human hybrid or deferring back to the human? Gen AI is very good at taking all the data about a business, creating a strong narrative about it, and serving it up to a human. But it is not good to then say, here's what you should do with that information in the context of your business. Certainly not without human guidance. And the reason is that if you give it the wrong objective, then all it's going to do is help you make bad decisions much faster and in a much more persuasive way. Because we all know Gen AI is very persuasive and it's very fast. You've interacted with it enough, it's going to tell you you're right. It's going to make you sound like you're great, you know? And so it's very easy for you to be like, oh, yeah, this is clearly what I should be doing with it. That's when you have to have experts who come in and say, where are my safety checks? How do I do model challenges? How do I make it essentially doubt itself? What are my majority vote things, right? Like, what are the mechanisms you can use to have the model self check over time? And then how do you couple it with human experts? One thing that I would talk about incredibly is like, we're always going to have people underwriting certain kinds of deals because we're going to need it to help monitor whether the models are, drifting over time. And also, how does it compare to human decisioning? And we don't want to lose that institutional knowledge. So having a good understanding of where do you want model intelligence and model human hybrid intelligence and human intelligence applied in your workflow is important. You can't just accept the models are more intelligent and therefore make it do everything. I'm very adverse to that because not only is there huge risk, but models they don't have they don't have a mental model. These models are not, they mimic human speech and it's a probabilistic model of language. And language so approximates human intelligence that it's easy to mistake it for having a mental model, but there is no brain there. And so that's one of the things where in the jagged frontier, you'll see the models get simple things right. And then the very next thing that's equally simple, completely wrong. So they can be unpredictably wrong. They might still be more right than humans on majority cases, but where they're wrong, a human would never get wrong because it doesn't make sense. And so once organizations have been burned a couple times and understand that like this is problematic, then the question isn't about capability. The question is about control, right? So when you see news presses of like, oh, like models can do everything, yes, assume models can do work of entire organizations and businesses, but how are you going to control the output to be best aligned with objectives? And that is what everyone is still trying to figure out. Us too. I think we've just we've done a little more and we've learned through small mistakes and small pilots to know how to put guardrails in and to keep the human involved because it's important to have people involved in certain parts of the process.
Absolutely. There's so much to unpack there, but I'll start with this one, which is you just mentioned mistakes. Tell us about one of your bigger mistakes through kind of your skunk works projects or what have you, and like a big lesson learned from that. I know there have been mistakes because
But yeah, no, I mean,
you guys are on the bleeding edge compared to some
yeah,
other folks. So
I will say that like we do stuff small. We will do small mistakes first and check, right? So one of the times there's a few things that come up that's kind of funny. One is I don't know if they're funny, but they're interesting. Okay,
Mhm.
one was, we were doing trials of like pulling data on merchants, and then one of the merchants came back as oh, this person, there was like a criminal record, for example. And we're like, I don't know that that's true. It was like a news article about the merchant, I think, and I can't remember specifically, but I'll give you sort of the example that's in spirit, kind of the same, which is like, oh, the merchant like physically assaulted some other person, right? And then we went back and looked at the article, and it was actually the merchant who was assaulted, not the other way around. But it was very easy to have that flipped around. And then so we're like, oh, yeah, we should be very careful about how we are looking at this information and make sure we're asking for multiple sources and double checking. So that's one example of like building in some redundancy into checks, right? Another one was like earlier on, I think this has changed, but earlier on, we found that it was pretty easy to use Gen AI, which is a multimodal model, to bypass reCAPTCHA checks. And so we were like, we should probably not do that, right? I mean, it's like not that you can't because it would make the automation easier, but if a website or something is built for you to not to be secure and you have a way to bypass security, then you have to make an internal decision ethically to not do that. So even though you found the capability, doesn't mean that that's what you should be doing. And then I think like I already talked about how we spent, almost a year trying to mimic automation, trying to mimic exactly human behavior, and then having to backpedal. And essentially, we started several times because part of it was changing the mentality of the people who were working with these tools, not so much that the tools themselves were wrong. And then I think there was also, as we continue to develop, there was just a lot more conversation in the company about like, who has permissions to do what, right? Because you can potentially have an agent that's like a web crawling type controls your browser, essentially go into certain databases and do certain things on your behalf, but it could also decide to delete or change certain things on your behalf, and you would never know. And so while we have not had that happen, it was definitely flagged as risks that we have to be careful of, and then figuring out how to permission people the right way. So I would say like some of the bigger mistakes is like the time and resources wasted in trying to not really understanding how to use Gen AI, trusting it too much, and then having to come back and understand the deficit and the liability associated with it. Right. I have also seen, I think, and this is not like a mistake that cost us money, but I would say that like the messaging around the enthusiasm that companies have around using Gen AI for cost cutting and efficiency and productivity gains, like that message has to start changing because when we first got on this train, that was also the message that we wanted to send to employees. And without employee training, without employees feeling like they're really part of what we're trying to build, I think there was some resistance and there's probably some sabotaging that went on. And it was really on the leadership to turn and flip that message around and say, no, we're not going to do that. In fact, we kind of forbid ourselves from saying that's the only thing we're going to do. And then you saw sort of the more innovative ideas come through. You saw people much more willing to engage and build with it because all of a sudden they're not so afraid that all you're trying to do is make this tool and somehow try to displace them. And so once that story gets built into, once that story, the narrative of like, we're going to use it to replace humans starts to grow in an organization, then it kind of becomes a virus and you can't really take that back. And so I think it took a little bit of us from a messaging perspective too, to understand like, well, why isn't adoption happening the way we think that it should be happening, even though we have done the training, even though we have really tried to help people get access to tools. And it's really understanding that like it comes with a generative AI comes with a deficit of trust. It's built into the messaging. And so when you are saying things like, oh, we're going to use AI to do X, Y, and Z, what you should be saying to yourself is replacing the words with deficit of trust and see how that comes across to people. If you're saying things like, we have to be really careful with how we're using AI. That sounds very different than you're saying, like, we're going to use AI to cut heads and be more efficient, because you're really leaning into that deficit. And I think it exposes that across every organization where you don't have the right trust built with your own employees or customers.
We talk a lot about the technology, but it's so important to focus on the people, right? None of this works without adoption. So, two-part question. One, do you worry about kind of shadow AI, meaning, people at the organization using personal accounts and sharing information they shouldn't? And second part would be, I'd love to hear a little bit about, you touched on it, but like adoption. How do you like? What are some of the keys to adoption? But first, shadow AI problem.
So our CTO worries more about shadow IT than I do, but I will say that, like, we have done, I think, a good job in terms of getting ahead of it. Here's a real life example, because this just happened like a month ago. So in our company, everyone has access to Gemini, which is, a pretty powerful model. But as people started working, they want access to another frontier model, like a ChatGPT 5. At this 5.2, 5.2, 5.3, I can't keep up. Opus 4.7, right? So we had a leadership team where, like, hey, we're really looking at AI initiatives. We want to encourage people to do this, and we're going to start giving people access to enterprise level accounts. So please make sure that you can get on that. And then I get a fair question, which is like, well, how do we make sure people justify their use of this? And they need to write a business case and write up a one pager on, like, how they're going to use it, and then we'll pay for the account. And immediately I was like, nope, we're not going to do that, because we went to the company and said, this is something that we are very proud of, that we're leading in, and we want employees to embrace. And now that people are interested, we're going to make them jump through hoops to access the frontier models. And I said, I want to make the barrier to entry as low as possible. So what we have said is, like, we will give, let's see who's interested. If it's not a lot of people, then we will give everybody access to the tool for 30 days. If it's a lot of people, we're going to do a rotational 30-day type thing. At the end of 30 days, you do a little quick write up on, like, hey, what did you do? And did you find it more useful than Gemini? Yes or no? And if you are like, yep, here's what I did, this is why it's interesting, I'm going to keep using it, then we'll keep your account. If you're like, I tried it, it's really not that great, or I didn't really get a chance to because I was too busy, that's okay too. Then, you're not ready. And so, like, I want to make sure that we don't create the barrier to entry up front. We let people use these tools at the enterprise level, so they're not doing stuff on their personal accounts. And then, tell me that you find it effective, and we'll keep paying for it. If you don't find it effective, or Gemini, which comes with our workspace, is good enough, then it's good enough. At least you've experimented with another one. So that's one, how I got ahead of the whole, like, shadow AI problem. The other one, where you're talking about adoption, right? I would go back to sort of Ethan Mollick's framework around, you have to have three pieces in an organization. It's called the crowd, the lab, and the leader. So, or some version of that. Basically, you have to have little experiments and teachings that are kind of bubbling up from inside the company, employee interest, engagement, building it into part of the culture. Then that's the crowd. Then your lab is really your tech team, your skunkworks team, that are taking the best opportunities and putting them into the enterprise level initiatives, right? Those are then behind APIs. There's real coders. There's real developers now working through these things. Humans are not checking everything. You're not in a chat window anymore. You're doing agents, and you're serving the highest priority business needs. Then you have to have top-down strategic leadership, which is around, what are the good use cases? What are the risks involved? How do we better upskill our people? And how do you think work is going to look like in 5 years for all of your departments? What are the competencies that you need? And how do you run scenarios? You can do this with AI, right? To prepare your workforce. So when we first started, we had, I went to Wharton, I took some classes, I came back, recorded a video, and I taught the entire company everything I learned. I've taken 3 courses. I've done more than 10 plus hours of materials, in-depth material at this point. So then we created Gen AI Champions group, where we had 100 plus documented use cases. Now we're on the second version of that group, which is a smaller group that's building agents. So it was only until, like, the first 100 use cases that I was like, oh, we should probably have a strategy. we should probably like have a handbook on like what is the right use case. So you kind of stumble into how do you get people to adopt. But you start by building the culture from the ground up, removing the fear, teaching people what an LLM is, how does it work. And I remember that's what I had to do. Is like, what is a large language model? What is the transformer model, right? Like what does that mean? Why is it different this time? So like teaching people, taking away the fear of working with it, and then slowly you build into, the incubation team. These are your front runners, people who are already straining at the leash, like, hey, I need access and I want to build this stuff. And then having that strategy where you get the executives aligned. The tricky thing about these three parts of an organization is that they don't move at the same clock speed and they're messy. And you can't just say, I'm going to design these three things and they're going to happen perfectly. It's really like you design one, you stumble into one because you're trying to do the right thing and it's messy. And then you're like, oh, I kind of need this other piece. By the way, I just had my second executive offsite on the future of work here at Credibly because it's been 6 months and everything we said 6 months ago is like not that relevant anymore. So keeping up with the pace of change. So I think in terms of adoption, it's the same framework around change management. You need a top-down view, you need buy-in from the bottom, and then you need the group that's actually responsible for quick wins and business results. How all of these things mesh together and who has the credibility in the company to actually be leading this, that's the hard part.
Sure is. It sure is. We're all struggling with that, I think, right now. Last question for you. And you just mentioned the future of work. And I want to hear your vision about the future of work, either specifically or credibly or more broadly, but not 6 months. I can see 6 months. What about 18 months or 24
Mm.
months? What does the
Yeah.
future of work look like?
Wow, I would if I could be right about this, then I have a permanent job security. But so I will say a few things in terms of how I think about it, because obviously I can't predict the future. One is that I think that things that you think will develop in 24 months is probably going to develop in 12 months, and things you think are going to develop in 12 months are probably going to develop in 6, right? So there's already a lot of conversations around AGI and what AI labs are doing. Are they trying to build like an AI god under which we are all servants, right? Then there's a reality of how companies and businesses actually function. And so you have most workflows where how decisions are being made, they're not really primed for AI. The data is not there. Companies are still very much controlled by their IT departments on using Copilot and Copilot only. Like there's real like when the rubber meets the road, like what happens versus like this beautiful vision of like this AI god that's benevolent and doing everything. I will say though that what I'm chosen to, I think there's two things that are true in my mind, and I could be wrong. So let's be frank here, right? I believe in these things does not mean that just because I believe in them does not mean that they're facts and they're gonna happen. One is, I think the future of work for your organization is a decision that the top leadership makes, and it is not a decision that just happens to them. And I don't know why people would leave that decision up to AI or any other environment when you can say, this is what I want the future of my organization to look like, and I'm going to evolve myself towards that. So if leaders can take ownership of that and say like, no, 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 like I'm going to set the direction and I'm going to use the technology to help me get there, then I think that's very important, right? So if you're like, the future of my work is I want to have 0 employees and I want to have a bunch of AI agents that's going to replace everyone except me, the CEO, that's a future you can go espouse. That you can probably try to go make that happen at what cost, what risk, whatever. But that's one future, right? You can also have a future where you're like, I'm going to use AI in these use cases only. It's to free up capacity. Everything else is going to be manual touch because guess what? I'm a luxury company and people respect the human element and the heritage and the storytelling, and they don't want artificial stuff in our industry because they don't inspire trust. And so I have a couple of frameworks I've developed to help people understand like where they should be thinking about AI, what are the risk tolerances of not only specific departments in the business, but tasks within that department. And that's how I'm getting the organization to move. There's a level of complexity that we have to acknowledge that comes with AI adoption. I will say it took me personally 3 years to figure out what I think is how I want to evolve credibly, which is the human AI hybrid. And I talked a little about that intelligence model, but it's really about where can you use AI to serve the people better? And where can you use people to make sure you're using the AI's best advantages, right? So, like having, for example, I'll just use marketing as an example, having a brand voice and look and feel that is very much determined by humans is important because that's what makes it authentic. We've all seen how AI writing kind of all converges to be the same level of mediocre kind of garbage. Funny story, I had somebody comment on one of my LinkedIn posts, and then I saw that somebody else commented on someone else's LinkedIn post, and it was like literally the exact same structure with the this is a great post, but it was just like so obvious, right?
And there's like an M dash right in the middle of
Yes,
it.
I mean the M dash people can change, but just the way that it's written is like use your brains, right? So having an authentic brand voice in a world where you know there's going to be a lot of AI generated crap, like that's important. But having AI help you come up and brainstorm what that could look like, and you make the decisions. You're the taste, right? You're the filter for like what I want that voice to be. But I can come up with more voices and more attributes than I can imagine. That's that working with AI that's really important and interesting. I've told my brand manager, I want you to come up with an AI look and feel so that we understand what our AI footprint looks like versus human generated content. Because people are going to want to know what does Credibly's AI content look like and what does human content look like? That's a new brand. And so when you get into a groove of working with AI, it really feels like you're in the room with a smart partner who is helping you be better. It does not feel like you're delegating to someone and then being really frustrated that they're not getting what you're saying, or that you've completely just lost all sense of control and you're taking the prepackaged answers and you're shipping it as the right answer. When you work with AI enough, you get into this really interesting balance where you feel good about working with it because it's teaching you things that you didn't know, but ultimately you are optimizing for the things that you're really good at and you're not losing your creativity and you're not losing your strategy, but you can see how it's challenging and making your stuff better and helping you shape things better. That is hard for me to scale and also quantify. I can just tell you, like, when you get that feeling, and I have gotten it a couple times, I've created initiatives with people and watched how they work and the level of interest and enthusiasm in terms of doing bigger and better things that unlock their own potential is where people feel the best in working with AI. And it is possible, but it takes years to get to that point. So I think organizations should start that now, right? And don't let the first wave of ideas of like, let's just use it to be efficient and more productive, blah, blah, blah. Like, don't stop there and force yourself to say, if I removed all those ideas off the table, what is the next set of ideas that come up? And I promise you, those ideas will be more interesting and more innovative and have more growth and revenue potential than just a race to zero, which is cut costs down to zero, which every competitor can emulate at some point. And there's a limit to that. So that's your question, was the future of work. I think if you can find that human AI hybrid in your organization and then pivot your organization to try to achieve that, then I think it's a win-win.
I absolutely love that. We have a we have a term for that here. We call that captaining, where you are the captain, but you have your team of AI to help you, to support you. And I have felt that zone that you're talking about. And it's a really beautiful thing when
Yes.
you're like, we are creating something that I couldn't do on my own, but that is getting better with that help.
Yeah.
And so with that, you know, very insightful thoughts here, MJ. You know, if anybody wants to get in touch with you or with Credibly, what's the best way to do that?
Well, Credibly is a public website, right? Credibly.com. If you want money, let me know. But I'm on LinkedIn. If you want funding, I'm on LinkedIn. People can follow me. I often write there. We're probably going to have a Substack soon as well, so where our leadership is going to start writing some of these thoughts. But I post quite a bit on LinkedIn. I don't really do other social media, but I try to write about AI on LinkedIn and And also my PR team, as you know, is happy to take any requests.
They are. They are. Well, thank you once again, MJ, Chief Strategy Officer from Credibly. Great conversation. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.